Get
He
out! You're
signed
not
her
welcome!
away like a business transaction, tossed her out of his estate before the ink had even dried on their marriage certificate. But what Lord Sylvander Ashcroft never bothered to ask was why the crumbling old manor at the edge of Blackmere Moor had been left specifically, and only, to her. What was buried in those walls? What had her grandmother been hiding for 30 years? And why did 3 powerful men suddenly want her dead? Stay with me, loves. Because this secret, it doesn't just ruin him, it burns his entire world to ash. If you're new here, subscribe. You will not want to miss what happens next. The morning Isolwen Fairfax was handed her own dismissal letter, the sky over London was the colour of a bruise. She stood in the grand entrance hall of Ashcroft House. Still wearing the pale ivory gown she had been married in exactly 11 months ago. The same gown. Because she had never been given anything else. No wardrobe, no household allowance, no title used with any warmth. Just a ring that sat too loose on her finger, a bedroom at the far end of the east wing, and a husband who looked through her like she was made of smoke. Lord Sylvander Ashcroft did not look through her today. Today, he looked directly at her, and that was somehow worse. He was standing at the foot of the marble staircase, tall and cold and perfectly composed, his dark coat pressed without a single crease, his jaw set like a man who had already moved past this moment before it had even arrived. He held the letter out to her between 2 fingers, the way one might offer something mildly unpleasant to a servant. "You will vacate the premises by noon," he said. No apology, no explanation, no flicker of anything human behind those grey eyes. Isolwen did not move immediately. She had learned, in 11 months of marriage to this man, that stillness was the only power she had left. "You are dissolving the arrangement," she said quietly. It was not a question. "My solicitor will contact you regarding the annulment." He was already turning away, already done. Something inside her chest pulled tight. Not from heartbreak. She had buried that particular hope months ago, but from something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to fury. "You never once asked my name," she said to his back. "Not my given name, not once in 11 months." He paused, just for a breath. Then he continued walking up the stairs without a word, his footsteps unhurried, his spine never bending. Isolwen Marsh, Isolwen's lady's maid and the only soul in that house who had ever spoken to her with genuine kindness, appeared from the side corridor with a travelling cloak already in her hands. Her eyes were red at the rims. She had known before Isolwen had. "I packed what I could," Isolwen whispered, draping the cloak over Isolwen's shoulders. "Your books, your mother's letters, the small things. How long have you known?" Isolwen looked away. 3 days, my lady, 3 days. He had planned this for 3 days, and not a single person in that household had thought her worthy of a warning. Not a whisper, not a kindness. Isolwen fastened the cloak at her throat and picked up the letter from where she had let it fall to the floor. She read it once, slowly, then folded it with deliberate care and tucked it into her pocket. If Lord Ashcroft expected tears in his entrance hall, he would die waiting. She walked out of Ashcroft House under a bruised London sky with her head straight and her hands steady, and only Isolwen beside her. The carriage that had been arranged to take her away was plain and unmarked. No Ashcroft crest, of course. He would not even brand his cruelty with his name. It was inside that carriage, once the door had closed, and the horses had begun to move, and the towers of Ashcroft House had disappeared behind grey morning fog, that Isolwen finally unfolded the second letter, the one she had been carrying close to her body for 6 weeks, the one that had arrived on a Tuesday with a wax seal she did not recognize, addressed to her alone in handwriting that belonged to no one living. It was from her grandmother's solicitor. Araminta Deverell had died quietly in the night, 3 months before the wedding, and had left behind a single possession of any significance. Not money, not jewels, not the kind of inheritance that made men sit forward in their chairs. She had left Isolwen a house, Blackmere Hall, on the edge of the moor, a property so old and so isolated that even the solicitor's letter carried a faint reluctance in its phrasing, as though the man himself had not entirely wished to be involved. Isolwen had told no one about the letter, not Sylvander, not his solicitor, not even Isolwen. She looked out of the carriage window at the city thinning into open road, at the sky pressing low and heavy over the hills ahead, and felt something shift inside her, something quiet and unfamiliar, not hope exactly, more like the feeling of a door she had not known existed, swinging slowly open in the dark. Isolwen was watching her. "Where are we going, my lady?" Isolwen tucked the letter away and looked ahead at the road. "North," she said, and then, almost to herself, so quietly that Isolwen had to lean forward to hear it. She left it only to me, out of everyone, only me. She did not say what she was thinking. She did not say that Araminta Deverell had been the sharpest woman she had ever known, a woman who chose every word and every action with the precision of someone playing a very long game. She did not say that a woman like that did not leave a crumbling house on a moorland to a discarded granddaughter out of sentiment. She left it because there was something inside it, and somewhere behind her, in the city she was leaving, 3 men Isolwen had never met were already asking questions about Blackmere Hall. The road to Blackmere Moor took 2 days and swallowed the light early. By the time the carriage turned off the main road and onto the narrow track that wound through the heather, the sky had gone the deep, bruised purple of late evening, and the wind was coming off the hills with a sound that was almost human. Isolwen had stopped talking somewhere around midday. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her eyes fixed on the window with the expression of someone preparing themselves for something they could not yet name. Isolwen understood the feeling. She had been holding the solicitor's letter so long the paper had softened at the folds. She knew every word of it by memory now, but she kept returning to one line in particular, a line she had read perhaps 40 times since London, and still could not fully settle in her mind. "The property is yours unconditionally and entirely, with one provision: that you take personal residence within 30 days of receipt of this letter." 30 days. She had received it 6 weeks ago. She had 4 days left. She had not allowed herself to think too hard about what that meant. About the fact that her grandmother, a woman who had lived her entire life by deliberate intention, had built a deadline into a dead woman's gift. About the fact that if Isolwen had stayed one more week in Ashcroft House, waiting for a husband who would never see her, she would have missed it entirely. The carriage lurched hard to the left, and Isolwen grabbed the door handle with a sharp breath. "We've lost the track," the driver called down, his voice tight. "There's no lamppost, no marker. I can't see the road." Isolwen pushed open the carriage door before Isolwen could stop her and stepped down into the dark. The wind hit her immediately, cold and insistent, pulling at her cloak and her hair. The heather stretched away on all sides into blackness. Above her the clouds were moving fast across a thin crescent moon, and for a moment she could see nothing at all. Then the moon broke through, and there it was. Blackmere Hall rose out of the moor like something that had grown there. Stone the colour of old bone, windows dark, ivy crawling up the east face in thick ropey fingers that had been pulling at the mortar for what looked like decades. It was not small. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had imagined a cottage, something modest and forgotten, but this was a proper hall, 3 stories, wide-fronted, with a roofline of uneven chimney stacks against the moving sky. Old, deeply structurally old, the kind of building that remembered things. A light was on in one of the ground floor windows. Isolwen went still. The solicitor had told her the property was unoccupied. She stood in the wet heather with the wind at her back and watched that yellow light and felt the hair rise slowly along her arms. Isolwen appeared at her shoulder and made a small sound that was not quite a word. "Stay with the driver," Isolwen said. "My lady, you cannot." "Stay with the driver, Isolwen." She walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked. More than unlocked. It was standing 3 inches open, and when she pushed it, the hinges gave a long, low sound, like something exhaling after holding its breath for years. The entrance hall was dark, except for the light spilling from a room at the far end of the corridor, and it smelled of cold stone and beeswax and something else beneath those things. Something older and faintly sweet, like dried flowers pressed inside a book. She moved toward the light. The room was a study. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a fireplace with the remains of a recent fire still glowing faintly orange in the grate. And at the desk, with his back to the door and a candle burning at his elbow and papers spread wide across the surface before him, sat a man. He heard her. She knew because his shoulders changed. A barely visible tightening, a stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. He turned slowly. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of face that had been arranged by difficult years rather than easy ones. Sharp at the jaw, careful around the eyes, dark hair that needed cutting. He was not dressed like a servant. He was not dressed like a solicitor. He wore the clothes of a gentleman who had been travelling and had not yet had cause to change. And he looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not surprise, exactly. More like a man who had been expecting something and was recalculating now that the something had arrived. Miss Deverell, he said. His voice was low and even. Fairfax, she said, and you are in my house. Something moved across his face. There and gone. Your grandmother sent for me. My grandmother is dead. Yes. He did not look away from her. She anticipated that. The fire crackled softly between them, and outside the wind pressed against the windows with long, slow weight. And Isolwen looked at this stranger in her dead grandmother's study, sitting among papers she had never seen, and felt the ground beneath this entire night shift in a way she could not yet measure. Who are you? She asked. He glanced down at the papers on the desk, and she followed his gaze without meaning to. And in that single unguarded moment, she saw her own name written at the top of a document she did not recognize. Not Fairfax, not even Isolwen. Her name before all of it. Her grandmother's name, her mother's name. A name that connected her to something she had never been told. My name is Caspian Thorn, he said. And before I answer any of your questions, Miss Fairfax, I need you to understand that the men who want what is in this house are already less than a day behind you. He stood then and held out to her the document with her name at the top, and she took it with steady hands, because she had decided somewhere on that dark moor road that she was done, being the woman who waited for things to happen to her. She read the first 3 lines. The paper went cold in her fingers, because what was written there did not just change her understanding of Blackmere Hall or her grandmother's intentions or the strange inheritance she had been handed. On the worst morning of her life, it changed everything she thought she knew about why Sylvander Ashcroft had married her in the first place. Isolwen read the document 3 times. The first time her eyes moved across the words without fully landing on them. The way a mind does when it is protecting itself from something too large to absorb all at once. The second time she read slowly, her finger tracing the lines without touching the paper. The third time she stood completely still and let every word settle into her like stones dropping into still water. Araminta Deverell had not simply been her grandmother. She had been the last surviving trustee of a land charter dating back 140 years, a legal document that granted the Deverell bloodline irrevocable custodial rights over a stretch of moorland that ran from the northern edge of Blackmere all the way to the boundary of what was now. After several decades of careful acquisition and consolidation, the primary estate of the Ashcroft family, not adjacent to the Ashcroft land, not bordering it, underneath it, the charter predated the Ashcroft title by 60 years. It had never been dissolved. It had never been purchased. It had been buried deliberately and systematically in the kind of legal obscurity that required both money and intent to achieve. And according to the document in her hands, the rights passed not through male inheritance, but through the female line, which meant they had passed from Araminta to Isolwen's mother, and from her mother, who had died when Isolwen was 7, directly and entirely to her. Sylvander Ashcroft had not chosen her out of obligation or social arrangement, or any of the cold practical reasons she had spent 11 months constructing in her own mind to explain why a man of his standing had married a woman of her modest circumstances. He had married her to get to this. She lowered the document slowly. Caspian Thorn was watching her with the careful attention of someone who understood that this moment required silence. He had not sat back down. He stood on the other side of the desk with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on her face. And she had the distinct impression that he had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and was now navigating the real one with whatever remained after preparation ran out. He knew, she said, it was not a question. His father found out about the charter 20 years ago. Sylvander has known since he was 19. 20 years of intent. 19 years of a man growing up with the knowledge of something that did not belong to him. Learning its shape, learning its edges, learning how to reach for it without appearing to grasp. The marriage was supposed to transfer custodial rights upon my signature, she said. There is a clause in the charter that allows voluntary transfer. If the rights holder signs before 2 witnesses and a legal representative. Caspian moved to the shelves behind him and pulled out a second document, older. The paper gone amber at the edges. The ink faded but legible. He set it beside the first. Your grandmother found a copy of the transfer request in Ashcroft's solicitor's files 8 months before she died. She had contacts. She had spent 40 years being underestimated by men who talked freely in her presence. Isolwen looked at the transfer request. Her own name was printed at the top in clean, careful script. There was a line for her signature at the bottom. It had been prepared. It had been waiting. She thought of 11 months of silence, of dinners eaten alone, of a husband who looked through her, and a household that treated her like a temporary inconvenience. She had believed it was indifference. She had believed she had simply failed to be interesting enough, present enough, worthy enough of his attention. It had not been indifference. He had been waiting for the right moment to put a pen in her hand. Something moved through her then that was beyond anger. Anger she knew. Anger was hot and immediate, and it burned itself out. This was colder and quieter, and it settled into the base of her spine, like a new kind of posture. Who are the men behind me? She said. Caspian's jaw tightened slightly. Leofric Vane. He acts as Ashcroft's legal enforcer. He has 2 associates, and they left London the morning after you did. He paused. They are not coming to negotiate. Then what are they coming for? The charter. If the document is destroyed, and there is no surviving rights holder to contest it, the Ashcroft claim becomes clean. He said it plainly. The way someone says a true thing they wish were not true. Your grandmother understood that once Ashcroft knew the marriage had failed to produce a signature, the calculation would change. The fire had burned lower. The room felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago. Outside, the wind had not let up, and somewhere above them, in the upper floors of the house, something shifted and settled with a sound like a held breath releasing. Isolwen appeared in the doorway, her cloak still on, her face pale, her eyes moving between Isolwen and the stranger with rapidly accumulating alarm. She had clearly decided that staying with the driver had its own particular terrors. There is a man at the edge of the tree line, Isolwen said, her voice very controlled. The driver saw him. He has not moved, but he is watching the house. Caspian moved to the window immediately, standing to the side of it rather than in front. Old instinct, trained instinct. Isolwen noticed that. One man tonight means the others are still hours behind, he said, more to himself than to her. He's been sent ahead to watch, to confirm you arrived. Then he will report back that I have, Isolwen said. Yes. She looked at the 2 documents on the desk. Then she looked at the shelves behind Caspian, at the rows of her grandmother's books and files, and the accumulated architecture of a very deliberate mind. And she thought about what Araminta Deverell had actually done, not simply left her a house, left her a position, left her something to stand on, left her the answer to a question Isolwen had not even known to ask. There is more in this house, she said. It was not a guess. Caspian turned from the window and looked at her with something that was almost respect and not quite surprise. Your grandmother believed the original charter documents, the ones filed with the county court in 1689, were hidden inside this house before the Ashcroft family could access them. She spent the last year of her life trying to locate them. He paused. She did not find them, but she believed they were here. She was certain of it. Isolwen picked up the candle from the desk and turned toward the door. Then we find them tonight, she said, before that man outside sends word, and before Leofric Vane arrives with whatever he has been sent here to do. Elowen made a sound of profound personal distress, but followed without hesitation, because Elowen had always been braver than she looked, which was something Isolwen had come to understand and depend upon in ways she had never properly said aloud. Caspian followed too, pausing only to take a small pistol from inside his coat and check it once with the efficiency of someone who hoped not to use it, and intended to be ready regardless. The upper floors of Blackmere Hall were cold in the way that old houses are cold, not from lack of fire, but from accumulated years, from stone that had absorbed 100 winters and never quite warmed through again. The candlelight moved across walls hung with faded tapestries and portraits of people Isolwen did not recognize, but who looked back at her with her grandmother's eyes. The same stillness, the same particular quality of observation. She stopped in front of one portrait, a woman, perhaps 50, painted in the style of the previous century, sitting very straight with her hands folded and a small, almost invisible tension at the corner of her mouth that Isolwen recognized intimately, because she had felt it on her own face every day for 11 months. Below the portrait, half obscured by the heavy frame, were initials carved into the plaster. Old, deep, A.D. Araminta Deverell. Not a portrait of an ancestor, a portrait of her grandmother as a younger woman, hanging at the top of the stairs of a house Araminta had known all her life. In a corridor Isolwen had never walked until tonight. She raised the candle higher and looked at the wall around the portrait more carefully. The plaster to the left of the frame was a slightly different shade. Newer, or rather, older in a different way, as if something behind it had been sealed rather than simply aged. Caspian, she said quietly. He was beside her in 3 steps, and he saw what she saw without her having to explain it. He pressed his palm flat against the plaster. Then he knocked once, twice, and on the third knock the sound changed, going hollow and brief and unmistakable. Isolwen pressed herself against the opposite wall and said something very quiet in a language Isolwen did not recognize, which she took to be a prayer. From somewhere below them, distantly but clearly, came the sound of the front door. Not the wind, not the settling of old stone. Someone had come inside. Caspian's hand moved to the pistol at his side, and he looked at Isolwen with an expression that asked a question without speaking it, the question being whether she understood what was now beginning and whether she was prepared to stand in the middle of it. She looked back at the hollow wall, with her grandmother's portrait watching from above it, and thought about a man who had looked through her for 11 months, who had planned and waited and prepared, and still, in the end, had not thought her worth explaining himself to. She thought about what it meant that her grandmother had left the answer here, specifically for her. She lifted the candle and turned to face the staircase. She was prepared. The footsteps below were unhurried. That was the most frightening thing about them. Not loud, not rushed, not the stumbling entry of someone who had forced their way in and was uncertain of their surroundings. These were the footsteps of someone who had been here before, or had been told exactly where to go, moving through the dark ground floor of Blackmere Hall with the calm of a man who did not expect to be stopped. Caspian pressed close to the wall at the top of the staircase and held up one hand. Isolwen stopped. Isolwen, behind her, stopped also, and the three of them stood in the upper corridor in absolute silence with only the candle Isolwen had not yet thought to extinguish, throwing their shadows long and unsteady across the ceiling. She extinguished it now. The dark came in completely, and for a moment there was nothing but the wind outside and the slow, deliberate footsteps below, and the sound of her own breathing, which she worked immediately to quiet. Caspian leaned close to her ear. "One person," he said, so low it was barely sound at all, moving toward the study, toward the documents. Isolwen thought with swift, cold clarity. The charter on the desk, the transfer request beside it, everything Araminta had assembled and hidden and left for her, sitting in plain sight on the ground floor, because they had moved upstairs too quickly, because she had been drawn by the portrait and the hollow wall, and had not thought to secure what was already found before going after what was still hidden. She turned in the dark and found Isolwen's hand and pressed the woman's fingers around the cold wax of the extinguished candle. Then she moved past Caspian toward the staircase. He caught her arm. She felt him shake his head in the dark, the movement communicating itself through the tension in his grip. She pulled her arm free and went down the stairs. She kept to the edge where the boards were less likely to speak, and she moved slowly, and she kept one hand on the wall, and she did not let herself think about fear, because fear was a luxury that belonged to a version of herself she had already left behind in the entrance hall of Ashcroft House that morning. The study door was half open. The light inside was not candlelight. It was a small, dark lantern, the kind designed to throw a directed beam without advertising itself to windows, and in its narrow light a man was standing at the desk, with his back to her and the charter documents spread open under his hands. Leofric Vane was older than she had imagined, broader. He had the physical presence of a man who had spent his life being useful to powerful people in ways that required him never to be squeamish about the methods. He wore plain traveling clothes, and his coat was dusty from the road, and he handled the documents with a familiarity that told her he had seen them before, or copies of them, or had been briefed on their contents in enough detail that he knew precisely what he was looking for, and precisely what he intended to do with it. He had a candle in his other hand, already lit. Isolwen understood in one immediate and absolute moment what he meant to do. She stepped into the room. "Put it down," she said. He turned without startling, which told her he had heard her on the stairs and had chosen not to react until he saw what he was dealing with. He looked at her with the assessing patience of a man who had encountered resistance before and had developed reliable methods of ending it. "Miss Fairfax," she said, "you've had a long journey. I'd ask you to step aside and let me finish this quietly. Those documents belong to me. They belong to a legal dispute that is about to be resolved." He glanced down at the charter with something close to boredom. "Lord Ashcroft is a reasonable man. There will be a settlement, something appropriate for a woman in your position." "My position," she said, "is rights holder of a charter that predates his family's title by 60 years. I would be careful about the word appropriate." Something shifted in his expression. Reassessment. He had been told she was a quiet woman, a manageable woman, a woman who had lived 11 months in a house that ignored her and had not made significant trouble. He brought the candle closer to the edge of the documents. "Last time," he said, and his voice had changed, the pleasantness entirely gone now, replaced by something flat and certain. "Step aside." Isolwen did not step aside. What she did was look directly at him and say, clearly and without any tremor at all, "The original charter documents filed with the county court in 1689 are in this house, not copies. Originals with the court seal and witness signatures. Destroy what is on that desk, and they still exist. Destroy me, and they still exist. You cannot finish this tonight, and you cannot finish it cleanly, and Lord Ashcroft needs to understand that before he sends anyone else to this moor." She watched him process this. She watched the candle in his hand not move closer to the papers. She had gambled on something she did not yet know was true. The originals existing. The originals being here. The originals being enough. And she felt the gamble in her blood like cold water, but she kept her face as still as her grandmother's face in the portrait at the top of the stairs. Behind Leofric Vane, outside the study window, a light moved across the dark moorland, then another, the rest of them arriving. Less than a day behind, Caspian had said. He had been wrong about the hours. Vane saw her eyes move and turned just enough to register the lights through the glass. And in the 2 seconds, his attention-divided Caspian came through the door. Fast and low, and the pistol came up level. And the dynamic in the room remade itself entirely. The documents, Caspian said to Isolwen, not looking away from Vane. She gathered them from the desk with both hands, the charter, the transfer request. Every page spread across that surface, and pressed them against her chest. Vane looked at the pistol, and then at Isolwen, and then at the window, where the lights on the moor were growing closer, and made the calculation of a man who was practical above all other things. "This is not finished," he said. "No," Isolwen agreed. "It is not." He left the back of the house, a door she had not yet found, and then the sound of him outside, and the lights on the moor shifting in response to him, and voices too distant to make out their words. Isolwen arrived in the doorway, looking as though she had aged several years in the last 10 minutes. Caspian lowered the pistol and looked at Isolwen with an expression she was beginning to recognize. That specific quality of recalibration that happened when someone discovered a person was more than they had prepared for. "You didn't know the originals were here," he said. "Not for certain. No. You told him that to stop him burning what was on the desk." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "It worked. This time." She looked down at the documents in her arms, and then at the window where the moorland lights had gone. Still not retreating, simply waiting, the way a tide waits without any urgency, because it knows the shore is not going anywhere. "We need to find what is in that wall before they come back with a better plan." She turned and walked back toward the stairs, the documents held against her heart, and she thought about Sylvander Ashcroft in his perfectly pressed coat at the foot of his marble staircase, already turning away before she had finished speaking. She thought about what it would mean when he understood that the woman he had discarded on a Tuesday morning in an unmarked carriage had walked into a house on the edge of the moor and found everything he had spent 20 years trying to reach. She thought about his face when he learned that she had not signed anything. She thought about how she intended to make him come to her. Not with anger, not with revenge, not exactly, though she would be dishonest with herself if she pretended that particular satisfaction held no warmth, but because she had rights, real ones, old ones, ones that had been waiting in this house for her specifically, left by a woman who had known exactly what she was doing, and had trusted her granddaughter to be equal to it. She reached the top of the stairs and raised the new candle Isolwen had lit and stood before her grandmother's portrait, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. Behind her on the stairs, Caspian said quietly, "They'll regroup by morning." "Then we have until morning," she said, and pressed her hand flat against the hollow wall. The hollow wall gave way on the third attempt, not dramatically, not with the groan of hidden mechanisms, or the theatrical revelation of a secret door swinging wide. It gave the way old things give when they have been waiting long enough. A section of plaster and thin lath pulling away from the inner frame in one quiet piece, as though it had simply decided the time had come. Behind it was a cavity no wider than a man's shoulders, cut into the space between the outer stone and the interior wall, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept its seal through decades of moorland damp, were the documents. Isolwen reached in and took them out with both hands. She did not unwrap them immediately. She stood in the candlelit corridor with the package against her chest and looked at the empty space behind the wall and thought about her grandmother as a younger woman standing in this same corridor, placing these inside and sealing the plaster over them with the knowledge that she might never be the one to open them again. Leaving them for a granddaughter she was not yet certain the world would treat fairly, trusting that the world's unfairness might, in the end, be precisely what brought that granddaughter here in time. Caspian stood at her shoulder and said nothing. He had a quality she was coming to appreciate, the ability to recognize when silence was the right thing to offer. She unwrapped them at the desk in the study, carefully peeling back the oilcloth to reveal documents that had survived 140 years. In near-perfect condition, the court seal pressed deep and clear into the first page. The witness signatures intact, the ink faded, but entirely legible. They were real, unambiguously, legally, historically real, and they said exactly what the copy had said, except that these carried the weight of original authority that no copy could replicate, and no destruction of secondary documents could erase. The Deverell bloodline held custodial rights over the land. The rights were held now by Isolwen. She set them down and looked at Caspian. What does he do when he finds out? Caspian pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down with the weariness of a man who had been moving hard for several days. Sylvander Ashcroft has two options. He challenges the charter in court, which means making the whole matter public and presenting himself as a man who orchestrated a marriage for land acquisition, or he negotiates. He will not want the first. No, he will not. Then he will come here himself. Caspian met her eyes. Yes, I think he will. Outside, the moorland was dark and quiet. The lights she had seen through the window had disappeared, and she did not believe for a moment that meant Vane and his associates had left the county. They had withdrawn to wait and report and receive new instructions. The next move would come from Ashcroft directly. She understood him well enough to know that, when the managed approach failed, he would come and manage it himself, because he was a man who trusted his own capability above all other instruments. He had simply never considered that the instrument he had underestimated might have already moved beyond his reach. The next 3 days were not peaceful, but they were purposeful, which was a different thing, and in Isolwen's experience, a considerably better one. Caspian knew a solicitor in the nearest town, a man of genuine integrity and some courage, who came to Blackmere Hall on the second morning and sat at the study desk for 4 hours reviewing the original documents with the focused intensity of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and what it meant. He told her she had a case that would hold. He told her that with the originals in hand and the record of the marriage's intent established through Caspian's documentation, which turned out to be considerably more thorough than she had initially understood, she was in a position not merely to defend her rights, but to press an active legal claim against the Ashcroft estate for the decades during which those rites had been suppressed. Isolwen, who had been listening from the doorway with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink, made a sound of deep personal satisfaction. Isolwen sent a letter to Ashcroft House on the third day. She wrote it herself, without assistance, at her grandmother's desk in her grandmother's study, with the original documents in a locked case beside her, and the moorland grey and wide through the window. She kept it short. She told him she was in residence at Blackmere Hall. She told him she had the originals. She told him she had retained legal counsel. She told him that when he was ready to discuss a resolution, she would receive him, and that she expected him to come alone. She did not tell him she was afraid. She was a little, not of him. She had stopped being afraid of Sylvander Ashcroft somewhere between the hollow wall and the solicitor's 4 hours of careful reading. What she feared was simpler and more interior than that. She feared the version of herself that might, when she looked at him again, still feel the pull of the 11 months, the dinners alone, the long silences, the particular cruelty of being in the same house as someone who had decided you were not worth the effort of contempt, only absence. She did not want to feel that pull in front of him. She told Caspian this, the evening before Ashcroft arrived, because she had found, in the days at Blackmere, that Caspian Thorne was someone she could think aloud with, carefully, not carelessly, but without the constant interior editing that had governed every conversation in her previous life. He listened without interrupting and then said, "Feeling it is not the same as being governed by it. I know that. You know it intellectually." She looked at him. "Are you telling me I don't know it in the way that matters?" "I'm telling you that you will know it in the way that matters when he is standing in front of you and you discover what you do." He paused. "My expectation is that you will surprise yourself." Sylvander Ashcroft arrived on the 4th morning. He came alone as she had asked. He came in a plain carriage, no crest, the same consideration, she noted, he had extended to the carriage that removed her from his house, the instinct toward erasure operating even now. He stood in the entrance hall of Blackmere Hall in his dark coat and looked at the house around him with the expression of a man cataloguing something he had wanted for a long time, and was only now standing inside. Then he looked at her, and she saw something she had never seen in his grey eyes in 11 months of proximity. Uncertainty. She received him in the study at the desk, with the locked case beside her, and the solicitor's letter of representation on the surface in front of her. Caspian stood at the window. Isolwen was not in the room, but Isolwen knew she was in the corridor, and found that knowledge quietly steadying. Ashcroft sat down across from her. He looked at the locked case. He looked at her face. He was composing something. She could see the assembly of it in the slight tension around his mouth. The version of this conversation he had prepared, the tone he had selected. She spoke before he could begin it. "You chose me because of this land," she said. "I would like you to confirm that before we discuss anything else." A long pause. Then, with a precision that was almost admirable in its refusal to dress itself as anything other than what it was, he said, "Yes." The pull she had feared was there. She felt it, the recognition of it, the 11 months of it. She felt it, and she sat with it for exactly the length of one breath. And then she set it aside with the same deliberate care with which she had folded his dismissal letter in his entrance hall and put it in her pocket. "The charter rights are mine," she said. "They were mine when you married me. They are mine now. They will remain mine. The question is what you are prepared to offer in exchange for a formal agreement that defines the operational boundaries between your estate and my custodial rights going forward." She kept her voice level, practical, the voice of a woman who had been underestimated so comprehensively and for so long that she had simply stopped waiting for the world to correct its assumption and had corrected it herself. "Because I have no interest in litigation that ruins us both, and I have no interest in an arrangement that diminishes what is mine. You will need to find the space between those two things and bring me something worth considering." Ashcroft looked at her for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," he said. "No," she said. "I am not what you prepared for. There is a difference." He looked down at his hands. The great composure was still present, but there was something beneath it now that had not been there before. Not remorse, exactly. She would not give him that word yet, but the beginning of a reckoning. The first light of a man understanding what he had actually done, and being unable to look fully at it. "I will have my solicitor contact yours," he said finally. "You will have your solicitor contact mine by the end of this week," she said. "Or I file." He stood. He looked around the study once more. At the shelves, at the portrait she had moved, from the upstairs corridor, down to the wall behind the desk, where it now watched the room with Araminta Deverell's precise and patient eyes. He looked at the portrait for a moment longer than he looked at anything else. Then he left. Isolwen sat at the desk after she heard the carriage move away across the moorland track and let the silence of the house settle around her. It was a different silence from the silence of Ashcroft House. That silence had been the silence of exclusion, of rooms that tolerated her presence without acknowledging it. This silence was the silence of a place that had been waiting specifically for her, that had been arranged by a woman of extraordinary foresight to receive her. Isolwen came in and stood in the doorway and said nothing, which was the correct response. Caspian came away from the window and looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize and said, "Well, well," she agreed. Outside the moor was beginning to lighten. The clouds were moving in a way that suggested they might, some that afternoon, allow a small amount of sun. The heather was wet and very purple and went on a long way in every direction. Blackmere Hall was hers. The rights were hers. The case was solid, and Ashcroft knew it. And he would negotiate because he was, underneath the coldness and the calculation, a man who understood when a position was lost. She was not the same woman who had stood in his entrance hall 4 days ago in an ivory gown that had never been replaced. She was something she did not yet have a precise word for, something her grandmother had, perhaps always known she would become, which was why the house had been left with a deadline, and the documents with a seal, and the portrait hung at the top of the stairs like a promise. She opened the locked case and looked at the original charter one more time, Her name was not on it. It did not need to be. It ran in her blood, and it had been running there all along, waiting for the moment when she finally had cause to know it. She closed the case and looked out at the moorland and thought, not for the last time, and with increasing steadiness. Each time the thought arrived. That, being thrown away, had been the best thing Sylvander Ashcroft had ever done for her. She was not done with him yet. The negotiation would be long, and she intended to be thorough. But she was done being the woman he had expected. That particular door had closed. Every other one was open. The solicitor's letter from Ashcroft arrived on a Wednesday, 6 days after he had stood in her study and looked at her grandmother's portrait with something he could not quite conceal. It was thorough. She had expected that. Sylvander Ashcroft did not do anything carelessly, which had always been part of what made him so difficult to exist beside, the sense that every word and every silence was chosen with the same precision he brought to everything else. The letter proposed a formal boundary agreement, a legal delineation of the custodial rights versus the Ashcroft estate rights, drawn up in terms that were reasonable and in 2 places quietly generous. Generous enough that she read those sections twice, looking for the mechanism inside the generosity, before accepting that they were simply the concessions of a man who had done his arithmetic and understood where he stood. Her solicitor read it the same afternoon and looked up at her over the top of his spectacles with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years watching the powerful move against the unprotected and was experiencing something that was not quite familiar. He wants to settle, he said. Yes, quickly and cleanly. Yes, he looked back at the letter. There will be those who say you ought to push further. Take it to court. Make it public. Make him answer for the method of the marriage. Isolwen looked out the study window at the moorland, which had, as it had threatened to do that afternoon after Ashcroft left, allowed a considerable amount of sun. The heather had been extraordinary in it. She had stood outside for a long time watching the light move across it, and had felt something she was still in the process of identifying. Something that was not happiness exactly, but was its quieter and more durable cousin. I know what those people would say, she said. What do you say? He was quiet for a moment. I say that you have secured something permanent. The rights are established. The case is documented. Any future challenge fails against what you now hold. He set the letter down, and I say that public battles have a ways of consuming the people who win them as thoroughly as the people who lose. She had thought about this already. She had thought about it in the way she thought about most things now. Carefully, and without the old habit of anxiety turning it over, and looking at it from its different faces before setting it down. She had not come to Blackmere Hall looking for a war. She had come here because she had been thrown out of a house and had nowhere else to go, and because a dead woman had left her something she did not yet understand. The understanding had arrived. The war had arrived with it, briefly, and she had stood in the middle of it and had not broken. She did not need the war to continue to know what it had shown her. She signed the boundary agreement on a Friday morning with Isolwen as witness and her solicitor's careful seal beside her signature, and she felt the pen move across the paper with a steadiness that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had stood in Ashcroft's entrance hall 4 weeks ago in an ivory gown that had never been replaced. The agreement was sent. The response came within 48 hours. Ashcroft had countersigned without amendment. It was done. She did not celebrate. She sat at her grandmother's desk, in her grandmother's study in her own house, and let the doneness of it settle into her without trying to make it into more than it was. It was not a triumph in the way stories described triumphs, with a clear and luminous feeling of completion. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten. It was not simply part of her body, lifting away, not dramatically, just gone. Isolwen brought tea and sat down across from her without being asked, which she had begun doing in the second week at Blackmere, and which Isolwen had found she did not wish to discourage. "What happens now?" Isolwen said. It was the right question. Isolwen had been asking it herself in the small hours when the moorland wind came down from the hills and the house made its old house sounds around her, and she lay awake in the bedroom she had chosen for herself. Not the largest, but the one with the window that faced east and caught the first light on clear mornings. What happened now was that she had a house, and she had rights, and she had the beginning of something that felt, tentatively and without rushing itself, like a life she had chosen rather than one she had been assigned. What happened now was Caspian thorn, which was a thought she approached sideways, because it was not yet a thought she was ready to approach directly. He had stayed. That was the simple fact of it. He had stayed through the signing and the waiting and the solicitor's visits, and the 3 occasions on which Leofric Vane's associates had been observed at the edge of the moorland, before the boundary agreement made their presence both pointless and legally actionable. He had stayed, and he had been useful in the practical ways, knowing which roads to watch, knowing which letters to intercept, knowing the particular landscape of powerful men and their methods well enough to anticipate the next move before it arrived. But he had also stayed in the other ways, the evening ways, when the work of the day was finished, and the house was quiet, and the fire in the study had burned to the comfortable orange of late hours, and they had talked, not about the charter or the legal proceedings or Ashcroft's next likely maneuver, about other things, about her grandmother, whom he had known for 2 years before her death, having been engaged by Araminta to track the history of the charter and document Ashcroft's suppression of it, about his own history, which he gave her in pieces, not evasively but carefully, the way someone offers something valuable in increments, because they want to be sure of the hands they are placing it in. He had grown up at the edge of respectability, the son of a man who had possessed a minor title and a major gambling habit, inheriting at 19 the title without the estate and the reputation without the resources. He had made himself useful. He had become good at finding things that people did not want found, and understanding things that people preferred remain obscure. He had done some of this work for reasons he was not entirely proud of, and some of it for reasons he was, and Araminta Deverell had found him through a third party, and had looked at him across a tea table in a London drawing room, and had said, without any preamble, that she needed someone with his particular abilities for a purpose that was worth his best efforts, and that she was prepared to pay accordingly. He had asked her what the purpose was. She had told him. He had accepted without negotiating the fee, which had surprised Araminta, and which he now understood, telling Isolwen this on a quiet evening with rain against the study window had been the moment she decided she had found the right person. Isolwen had looked at him when he said that, and had felt something move in the region of her chest that she identified without much difficulty, and then set quietly aside to deal with at a time of her own choosing. That time was apparently now, because Caspian came to find her on the morning after the countersigned agreement arrived, while she was standing outside in the thin early light, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea and her face toward the east, and he stood beside her without speaking for long enough that the silence became a different kind of silence from ordinary quiet, the kind that contains something waiting to be said. "I was engaged by your grandmother to recover and protect the documents," he said. "That work is complete." "Yes," she said. "I have no formal reason to remain at Blackmere." She looked at the moorland. A bird was moving low over the heather, purposeful and unhurried. "No," she said. He was quiet again. Then, with the particular directness she had come to understand, was simply how he was, without performance or strategy. "I find I am not inclined to leave." She looked at him then. He was looking at the moorland, not at her, which she thought was a kind of consideration, giving her the space to receive what he had said, without the weight of his eyes on her face, while she received it. "Araminta chose carefully," Isolwen said. He turned to look at her now. "In most things, in all things that I have so far been able to examine." She looked back at the moorland and felt the warmth of the teacup in her hands, and the thin sun on her face, and the solid specific reality of the house at her back, her house, her land, her rights, written in ink that had survived a century and 40 years, waiting for her to come and claim them. "I think she would not object to you staying." He said nothing, but the quality of his silence changed in a way she had learned to read. She went back inside to find Elowen already rearranging the small sitting room with the focused energy of a woman who had drawn her own conclusions and was acting on them with characteristic efficiency. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Isolwen's life, and the best of them. She learned the house room by room, uncovering it the way you uncover someone you are just beginning to know, finding its habits and its history and its particular way of holding light in the late afternoon when the sun came low over the moor and turned the stone walls amber. She wrote to her solicitor regularly. She began a systematic review of all the documents in her grandmother's study, which were considerably more extensive than the charter papers, and which revealed, slowly and with the pleasure of genuine discovery, the full scope of what Araminta Deverell had spent her life building. Not just the land rights. Araminta had been corresponding for decades with other women in similar positions, women whose rights and properties and inheritances had been managed, diminished, obscured, or removed by the men around them. The letters were extraordinary, careful, intelligent, compassionate, and in several cases containing information that had significant legal bearing on situations that had not yet been resolved. Isolwen read them all. She began to understand what her grandmother had really left her. Not just a house, not just a charter, a purpose. The letter from Ashcroft came on a Tuesday, 43 days after the agreement was signed. Not through his solicitor, this time. In his own hand on plain paper, without the family seal. She recognized the handwriting from the single note she had received from him in 11 months of marriage. A brief, practical communication about a dinner she had been required to attend. It was not a long letter. He was not a man who wrote long letters. It said that he had reviewed the history of the charter more fully and understood now the extent to which his father had constructed the original suppression, and that he was aware this did not constitute exoneration of his own conduct, but that he considered it relevant context. It said that the method of the marriage had been wrong, not impractical, not poorly executed, wrong. The word sat in the middle of the brief paragraph like something it had cost him to place there. It did not ask for anything. It did not propose a meeting. It did not attempt to reopen anything that had been closed. She read it twice, and then she set it down and sat with it for a long time. She did not forgive him that morning. Forgiveness was not something she felt she owed him on any particular timeline, and she had long since stopped measuring herself against what she owed people who had not extended her the same consideration. But she felt something shift, slightly, in the architecture of how she carried what had happened, not toward him, toward herself. A small and private release of something she had not known she was still holding. She wrote back 3 sentences. She acknowledged the letter. She told him the agreement held, and she intended to honor it and expected the same. She told him she hoped he found, in time, a version of himself he could live with more easily. She sealed it and sent it, and did not think about it again. That evening she walked out onto the moorland as the sun went down and turned the whole landscape bronze and impossible, and she stood in the heather with the wind in her hair and Blackmere Hall behind her, solid and real and entirely hers. And she thought about the woman who had stood in a marble entrance hall 4 weeks ago, with nothing but a loose ring and a letter in her pocket, and a fury she had not yet found a use for. She thought about what that woman had walked into. She thought about what that woman had become. And here is what I want to ask you, because I think about this more than I say. Have you ever been thrown away by someone who thought they knew your worth? Have you ever been dismissed, overlooked, handed a door, and told to use it? By someone who had no idea what they were actually letting go? Because Isolwen's story is not just a story. It is the story of every woman who was told she was not enough and discovered, in the wreckage of that verdict, that she was everything. The moor is not finished with her yet. There are more of Araminta's letters to read. There are women who need what is in those letters. There is Caspian at the study window every morning, and the question of what that becomes. There is Leofric Vane, who accepted a withdrawal and not a defeat. And there is a difference between those two things that Isolwen understands in her bones. And there is a door at the back of the east wing that she has not yet opened, which Elowen noticed on the third day, and has been watching with quiet pointed significance ever since, and which Isolwen has been saving, deliberately, for the right morning. She thinks tomorrow may be that morning. If you have stayed with her this far, if you have felt what she felt in that entrance hall, or on that moor road, or in the corridor with the hollow wall, then you already know you are coming back for what is behind that door. Subscribe, loves. Stay close. Isolwen is only just beginning.